Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. We will talk about what could possibly be the new international global currency, critical minerals. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a senior non-resident fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. I have two fantastic guests with me here today who will help us understand what is at stake and how to handle our dependence on rare earth. First, we have Cullen Hendricks, who is my colleague and a senior fellow at Peterson as well. And we have Per Weijert, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor at the Luleå University of Technology in Sweden and also a professor in ore geology. So both very welcome. So rare earth metals, or rare earth oxides, or minerals, are a set of 17 heavy metals, which have a wide range of commercial and industrial use. We talk about bauxite, cobalt, lithium, nickel, copper, etc. And they're not only used in phones and computers, in future technology such as quantum computing, but they're also key in the transition to the green economy. They are used in batteries, in wind turbines, electric vehicles, etc. And our dependence on these materials will grow with hundreds of percent in the coming decades, according to some estimates, especially as large part of the world are boosting investments in green technology. So the problem is that the West is very dependent on China, who controls most of the mining and processing in the world. So the need to diversify is acute. There are minerals in many other countries as well, but the processing is complicated, lengthy, costly, and can be damaging to the environment. So how can we challenge the Chinese dominance and decrease our vulnerability? These are some of the items we will discuss here today. So starting with you, Per, in northern Sweden, there is a mining company, LKAB, who just revealed that it had found more than 1 million tons of rare earth oxides in Kiruna, up in northern Sweden. How important is this discovery and what consequences will it have for Sweden, Europe, and for the world?
Yes, thank you, and a pleasure to be here. So I'll try to answer that question in a few short words. Of course, 1 million tons of rare earth oxides is a lot of rare earth oxides, but I don't think that they ever released the grades. So the tonnage is one thing, but the grade is another. But it is a substantial discovery. So if you relate to the European market, that discovery in itself could actually sustain Europe for quite a few years with the needs for rare earth metals. So it's an important discovery, but it's still in the ground, and it's potentially a long time before it's actually being produced anything from that discovery. But they have other options as well from their old tailings, which also contains rare earth oxides. And I think that's what they are primarily going for. And that's also a big, huge resource in a European context.
So what does it take to take it out? Because discovering is and analyzing is one thing, but to get it on the market is something else. We talk about several years.
It's a long process in itself, because they need to, first of all, to mine it, of course, and then they have to refine it and then extract and separate the rare earth oxides, and in the end of the day then produce the different rare earth that is needed for primarily, I would say, for the permanent magnets in wind power and so forth. But that discovery that they announced a month ago, that's still in the ground, a couple of 100 meters below surface, and of course a couple of years before they will be able to extract from that deposit. Another thing is the tailings. That is actually happening now. So the company is establishing a refinery here in the town of Luleå in northern Sweden. Are actually starting to refine the rare earth oxides. So that's if everything goes well, so it's a couple of years ahead only. So in the not too far future, I think we can see production of rare earth in Sweden.
And there is enough there that could, as you said, provide Europe for a couple of years.
Yeah, for more than a couple of years, I would say that the resources together, the combined resources from the tailings and the resources in the ground, and the resources in the ground, they have not been defined yet. There is still perhaps even larger potential when they continue to drill that deposit, but it's probably enough for decades, to sustain Europe for decades.
That is interesting news. We'll come back to that. Cullen, in the US, how you are also, of course, largely dependent on this, and with the new investment package launched by the Biden administration, there will be heavy investment in green technology, so dependence will increase in the US as well. How dependent is US, and what's the way forward there?
Well, thank you, Cecilia, for that question. That's a challenging one to answer because, frankly, the degree of dependence varies pretty substantially across different classes of materials. And as you've already noted, that dependence is largely concentrated in China, due less to China's kind of geological advantages in terms of having very abundant sources of these kind of materials, and more due to the fact that China has pursued a relatively deliberate strategy over the last several decades of turning itself into the mineral processing hub of the global economy. If you think about China's broad pattern of industrialization over that same time period, there was certainly a lot of domestic demand for these kinds of materials to fuel their industrialization, and that the suite of kind of industrial policies that were associated with that, everything from building out kind of energy capacity for especially refining is incredibly energy intensive process. Mining can vary according to the different types of materials. But there was a lot of early investment in infrastructure that gave China sort of very significant advantages in terms of coming to dominate these kind of supply chains. So in the United States and EU, in this sense, I think that the picture is relatively similar, though the United States and the European Union have slightly different critical minerals lists. I know we're going to talk about kind of the 30,000 foot level kind of strategy around these in a little bit, but suffice it to say for the moment that yes, the United States finds itself largely import dependent on China for processed minerals, and is also import dependent in the sense that China itself is import dependent for many of the raw materials that it is producing. So it is dependent on the Congo, for instance, for the sourcing of cobalt. It is dependent on Australia and Chile to a certain extent for the extraction of lithium, which is then imported. So there are multiple stages at which there is some exposure to potential vulnerability associated with trade disruption. The United States finds itself in a materially somewhat similar situation to the European Union as well, in that the interest in these materials and the framing in terms of national and economic security has catalyzed a lot of attention in attempting to find new resources. There was a relatively large deposit of, I think, rare earths, niobium and zirconium that was recently announced having been discovered in Maine. And they're also going back through the tailings, so going back to old mine sites and sort of mining what at the time was considered to be either overburden or kind of extraneous material that needed to be removed to get to the ores, and now attempting to kind of mine that for economically usable kind of volumes of these kinds of resources. We talked a little bit about kind of some of the timelines here, but even if as these new resources are being discovered, it's important to keep in mind that it can be years before they're developed. I mean, I've seen estimates for a greenfield mining project in the United States taking anywhere from 10 to 17 years to really come online. And part of that just has to do with the massive scale of these kind of mining investments. Another part of that has to do with the regulatory framework and the permitting processes around these materials. And that is something that both the European Union and the United States are attempting to tackle in their recent kind of critical mineral strategies and the EU Green Deal investment plan.
So looking what is close by at home, but also trying to reduce dependence from China, because as you said, many of the mines are elsewhere. They are in Africa. We have also quite a lot of nickel in countries like Australia. There's lithium in Chile. There is copper in Chile and Peru as well. Some of these countries are friends and allies, but also in some countries they are, vulnerable states, and there are issues related not only to the costs and to the processing, but also human rights, a legal system that is transparent, and so on. What do you think? Is this going to be a new trade war, because the whole world will be looking for these metals, obviously? Or are we looking at, is this the new oil and gas? And who has then the upper hand? Is it only China? And if not China, who?
Well, that's a
difficult question.
No, that's an extremely freighted question. I'll be interested to hear Per's perspective on this as well. I think that clearly what we are seeing emerging, and this is not unique to critical minerals, this is a broader pattern of US and I suppose to a certain extent EU-China decoupling that is being driven by kind of the macro sort of an economic and security concerns that supersede sort of any particular discussion of a topic like critical minerals. One of the things that we haven't touched on yet, but I think is important to have in the background of this kind of discussion, is that when we talk about critical minerals, a lot of the current energy around them is coming from the obvious push to decarbonize our global energy and transport systems. But these critical minerals also have a vast array of applications in defense technologies. So if you want to field kind of a modern military in this day and age, you are going to be heavily reliant on sourcing of a variety of critical minerals as key inputs to these kind of defense and weapons systems. And so this is inherently a topic that is going to be framed, and the discourse around industrial strategy in this area is inherently going to, I think, take on a securitized kind of tone. China certainly has, I think, a head start in terms of having a national strategy around having built up both the trade ties and investment ties that have provided them sourcing to the ore itself, but then also obviously in refining capacity. Now, that's not something that's insurmountable. And the truth of the matter is that I think that what we will find, as we have also found in previous oil and gas booms, is that the amount of money that there is to be made and the amount of interest is going to be catalytic in spurring a lot of development and discovery. And so I think that that it is not the case that what we are going to be seeing in the coming decades is inexorably going to wind up being a competition over a fixed, or indeed in some senses kind of decreasing kind of pie of these kinds of resources that are out there. I think that a lot of the challenges that are going to occur are going to relate to attempts by the United States, its allies, but also its economic competitors to a certain extent in Europe, as they attempt to establish a set of economic relationships with a host of countries that don't necessarily look like, with respect to performance related to human rights or environmental regulations, et cetera, the kinds of countries that the United States and Europe are used to concluding, say, free trade agreements with, which would be one of the mechanisms by which you could secure supply. Now, a lot of that, I think, augurs towards relatively, peaceful or kind of market-oriented kind of solutions. But I think it's important, as I say that, to note that at this point, there are definitely some friction points in that augur towards a more competitive, say, neo-Cold War-like kind of existence between the United States and China. And one of those has to do with, as I mentioned earlier, China is also dependent on sourcing many of these raw materials from abroad for processing. So the exposure in terms of being dependent on these critical resources that need to be sourced from outside of the United States on the one hand and China on the other, sovereign territory, is relatively symmetrical. In the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, later Russia, had vast energy resources of their own. So the politics around energy at the time could have been a lot more fraught than they were if we were in a situation like we're in now, where both China and the United States are out scouring the rest of the world to find counterparties for developing these supply chains.
What's your view on this, Pat?
No, I agree with Cullen, but it's I'm thinking of this as sort. You mentioned trade war, Cecilia, and in a way, I think we've been in a situation like that for a long time, really. I remember where in the early 90s, when China reduced the price of tungsten in order to get control of the global tungsten market. That in effect, that meant that all the Western mines of tungsten went out of business because of the reduced price. So you can regulate or dysregulate the market if you can control the different commodities, and I think this is what China has been doing for a long time. And you also, I remember and I recall here in the European Union, we had a publication of the Raw Materials Initiative in 2008. The reason for that publication in those days, 15 years back, was that China kind of controlled the rare earth market already back then. So what we're talking about today already happened 15, 20 years ago. And in those days, Cullen, I think why China controlled the rare earth was basically because the Mountain Pass mine in the US was stopped because of environmental issues, as far as I remember. So the markets are delicate, and it doesn't take many new mines in order to disrupt or control the market, especially for these critical commodities. So in terms of the rare earth, we're talking about a global consumption or demand of around today 300,000 tons, which is nothing really in a global market. So if you're a strong player, you can control the market, and that I think will happen in the future, and we should not be naive about that. And of course, we all are firm believers in free trade, and of course, building a good relationship with other continents like Africa or Australia or countries that we I guess share a common belief in democracy and so forth. I think it's important to do. Besides, of course, I think looking into the possibility of being more self-sufficient in mining and also, of course, in the end of the day, recycling of these commodities. So I think we are in sort of a trade war. I think you can regard these commodities as the new oil and gas because they are needed for the green transition. It's basically all about energy consumption. So which is, of course, one way of looking into the similarities with where we were with oil and gas 100 years ago. So it's that dimension, what is happening now in the green transition. So it makes all kind of sense to be not naive about the global situation with and the commodities and the metals are not evenly distributed. They sit where they sit because of geological conditions, and they are different in different parts of the world, and you need to realize that.
I want to underscore something that Per mentioned in terms of the overall volumes and the size of these kind of markets, because it is the case that they are much more susceptible to market cornering and basically kind of other types of kind of market disruptions than are the much more fluid markets for, say, oil and gas. So to give you one little factoid, which I found kind of striking, is that in any given day, there are about 1 million open interest futures contracts related to West Texas Intermediate, which is the North American essentially standard, which would be equivalent to Brent in Europe. There are 1 million futures contracts traded on a daily basis. And this just means that there's a lot of fluidity in this market. The last time I looked at the London Metals Exchange, there were 13 total open interest contracts for cobalt. All right, this is a mineral that's absolutely critical for energy transitions, and it is a mineral that for which the markets around are just much smaller and much less developed. You can say the same thing about nickel. Last year the London Metals Exchange essentially had to halt nickel trading and unwind a bunch of trades that had recently gone through because one single trader was able to develop a near market cornering position over the period of about an hour. I mean, these are markets that, given their importance for energy transitions, are not close to being ready for prime time, so to speak, in terms of the financial development and also just the surveillability of them. Because as we're dealing with small amounts of commodities in many of these, and these are still physically traded commodities, there are just a lot of links in the supply chain that need to be fortified in order to ensure that you can basically conduct the transactions that are underlying all of kind of the green energy development that we would like to see moving forward.
And countries will obviously, as you say, take advantage of this. Indonesia, for instance, is a great producer of nickel, and they have a national ban on export on nickel, and I think they tried to do so on several other metals as well, but they are less dominant on that market. And cobalt, very frequent in Congo and in places like this, where also there is, the mining is not only dirty, but it involves child labor, it involves criminal groups taking over. So it's a process of due diligence both for European and American laws. So this definitely complicates the process, that it's not only expensive and high investment, it is also a dirty and difficult product to come out, which is also something that Europe and US and other Western allies have to take into consideration, whereas maybe China asks less questions about environmental standards and child labor.
Well, just on that point, where I sit here in Colorado was the sort of the epicenter for many years of the U.S. mining industry. It's now essentially the epicenter of the U.S. Superfund site scene, which just means that what we have here is we have a lot of massive remediation projects that are underway to undo many of much of the environmental damage that was associated with previous mining. Now, the mining industry has gotten better around these kinds of things, but to a certain extent, it is going to be impossible to avoid some of the localized environmental costs that will come with attempting to really reshore, either in the European Union or in the United States, supply chains for these materials. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, I'm not sure that there really is a lot in the industrial policies we've seen coming out of the United States or the European Union that signals that they really want to bring home or reopen mining and processing as parts of their sort of domestic economies. I think there's a lot more interest in trying to establish greater market share up the value chain and the higher value added, kind of cleaner to build products like electric vehicles or lithium ion batteries and the like. That's something that I think that there's kind of broad consensus on domestically in the United States. It's good politics here. I suspect it's good politics in the European Union. The mining side of things and the processing side of things will be more fraught.
You both mentioned different strategies. There is a strategy from the European Union coming in the coming weeks on the strategic materials and minerals. It's an update from an old one, so obviously what has happened the last years and the increased dependence will focus a lot on this. What should be in it, Per, if you were to advise the Commission? What should it address? Apart from the obvious,
what's on my wish list for the Critical Raw Materials Act? I really think that we should try to get. Europe is more dependent on imports than the US in terms of metals. So we are really living in the part of the world where we have the poorest self-sufficiency in most commodities. So and we have a domestic potential in the ground, which we are not utilizing. And this, I guess, Cullen, again, goes back to what you were just mentioning regarding the social acceptance of mining, which is, I think, a big issue. If in many parts of Europe there is simply not a social acceptance for any mines, regardless of people understanding that we need these commodities, we need to take care of this is another way than putting up a new mine in this part of the world. So we need to seriously discuss the NIMBY effect in Europe, I think, especially in the areas where there is a good potential for mining still, which in fact there is in many parts of Europe, not the least here in Sweden. So one thing that I've been thinking of a lot the last few years is the exploration side of things. So the very early stages of the business, and how little of the global investment that comes into Europe because of this, that there is simply no trust in investing money in exploration in Europe, because in the end of the day you will not get the permits. It will take you 10-15 years to get it, possibly, and in the end of the day you might not get it. So that are poor market conditions, and that's the list that the Fraser Institute is producing every year. You can see that a lot of the countries in Europe has dropped. Sweden, for instance, has been in the top for many years, but now we are dropping because of these unpredictable conditions with the permitting process, for instance, and the social acceptance. So I really want to see some kind of framework which take care, you could say, about exploration and encouraged exploration investments in Europe, because that has been out of the picture totally. Some people say it starts with a mine. I say it starts with a geology, and you need to invest in those early stages of the mining value chain as well. So that's one thing. I think we have already touched on permitting conditions, and that's member state jurisdictions to a large extent in Europe. But you need to address that, I think, also in this European Critical Raw Materials Act. There is also discussion what are critical and what are strategic metals, and should we focus only on critical commodities? And we just said that for many of these commodities, it's the global market is not huge. It's just 1 or 2 or 3 mines coming on stream, and demand is there, supplied from these 3-4 mines. But the strategic metals, for instance, when you electrify the society, the big important metal then is copper, or perhaps even iron and steel. So I would like to see a more holistic approach to the supply of resources in general, metal and mineral resources in general, and of course the policy and regulatory framework, as we have already said, that's very scattered in Europe. And I think if we can get some harmonizing of that regulatory framework installed as well, I think that's a good way forward. So there are many things in the European context that perhaps are much more complex than in the US framework, I would say.
Well, in the US, there is a Critical Materials Act from 2021, I think. Does it address these issues as well, Cullen? Or does it need updating?
Well, I think it is I would say it is a start in terms of elaborating a coherent strategic priority. And that doesn't sound like a great achievement if you think about the kind of partisan gridlock and polarization the United States has been dealing with for the last several years, maybe last decade at least. This is, I think, a relatively substantial a win, in terms of elaborating kind of a coherent vision of what the future needs to look like. Now, having said that, I mean, I think that again, and this relates to some of my earlier comments, I think that there is a lot of talk about wanting to create a U.S. supply chain for these kinds of resources. But what I'm seeing in terms of the actual, say, tax incentives that have been created to facilitate investment in productive capacity, again, those are heavily slanted toward the cleaner and the higher value added and in terms of final assembly and manufacturing. I don't think that they're going to substantially move the needle in terms of, say some of the regulatory things that Per was getting into, which is, that the European draft plan, at any rate, it is going to attempt to create what they were referring to as a one-stop shop, right, for the permitting process in order to try and get some efficiencies across the various different levels of government that exist within the European Union. The United States notionally has some ideas to do this, but I think that it would be a striking achievement for the United States or Europe, for that matter, to, in any short amount of time, get their permitting processes more in line with, say, the permitting processes of other advanced economies that are very mining and mineral oriented, like Canada and Australia, where permitting is a maybe 2 to 3 year process as opposed to a anywhere from 7 to 10 year kind of process. I think that there are aspects of not just the Critical Minerals Act, but then also the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly its provisions around domestic or free trade partner-based sourcing of inputs for electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries in order to unlock these kind of tax incentives. They're attempting to force the creation of a supply chain on the demand side without, I think, really paying adequate attention to the earliest links in the chain, which are going to be where we really need to see the widening in order to ensure stability and availability of supply. So I don't think that there's enough there that's been done yet, but I'm skeptical that either the United States or the European Union, absent truly cataclysmic kind of conditions in global affairs, would reorient themselves holistically in terms of what was referred to earlier as kind of NIMBYism, in terms of the suite of kind of environmental concerns that are related to mining and social acceptance of mining. And so I think that a lot of this, frankly, is a discussion that's occurring at a level that is a little high-minded, given the practical realities of the politics of trying to do greenfield mine and processing development in the United States. And I won't speak for the European Union, but my suspicion is that it may be similar.
It's complicated processes, of course, and there's a lot of social concerns, as you say, environmental concerns, and then, of course, all the impact assessment that has to be done on a more technical ground, huge investments. In northern Sweden, there is the Sami people and their reindeers, who are also very important part of the stakeholders and in the debate. But at some point, there's also the question of whether to do it a little bit more expensive and clean in some countries, or dirty work in others, and that has to be weighed in. There has been talks both in the US, but particularly in the EU, also in the upcoming drafting of this strategy, that there is a need of some sort of global alliance on raw materials and critical minerals, which would, I guess, then also encompass joint investments, because there's a lot of technical investments that needs to be done, and it will be costly if you are to pursue that way to mine closer to home or in Europe and in the West. Do you think it is realistic with such an alliance, and what would it achieve? Starting with you, Pat.
Yes and no, I would say. I think it makes all kind of sense to start discussions on the top political levels with other jurisdictions. Colin, I guess you mentioned Africa, for instance. That's a continent with a lot of resources. So that we need to see the win-win situation in those negotiations. So I think to some extent it's good and it's important, but I think in the end of the day, we really need to trust in free trade and that we really have global markets. There's going to be disruptions on that market, but we really to believe in it. And I think building those global alliances or whatever you'd like to call them, I think that's part of the game. But I also think that we need to look into our own consumption patterns and production patterns. So Europe, for instance, will never be fully self-sustained on maybe a few commodities, but that's really a few in that case. So we need to rely on imports, and if you rely on imports, then I guess it makes all kind of sense also to have those negotiations and discussions on the top level, political level, on how can you create those markets and win-win situations. And I see a lot of opportunities with Africa, for instance, if we want to go that way, which I think we should, and perhaps also with South America, which is more sort of mature on the metal market. Yes, I think it's, but it's not the only solution, and I think there's going to be disruptions in those talks as well over the years to come. So yes and no.
You've written about Africa a lot, Cullen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comments on this potential global alliance?
Sure. So at the macro level, I guess what I would say, I need to be careful about using the term macro in this context because this is a trade-oriented outlet. So I will say at the big picture, meta-conceptual kind of level, the idea that you are going to have a stable, relatively smoothly operating alliance between producers and consumers who have fundamentally different preferences about they may have similar preferences about stability of markets, but they certainly have different preferences around prices. I think that kind of alliance is going to be relatively difficult to form, and it will also be difficult to form a truly global kind of alliance, simply because of the geopolitical kind of element that we've already been discussing to this point. In terms of whether or not an alliance between the United States and Europe could be useful, I think that Africa may be actually a place where coordinated kind of investment and partnership development strategies would make a lot of sense. There's been much. The first reality is simply that there are lots of critical mineral resources on the continent, and even sort of if you make kind of heroic assumptions about levels of industrial development on the continent, there will still be these massive exportable surpluses, which will be globally important for meeting global needs. The practical challenges are challenges related to developing energy infrastructure, to catalyzing investment in regions where there frankly is a relatively high level of kind of political risk. The types of investments that we're talking about in terms of developing mining capacity are decadal in terms of their timescales when you're thinking about maturity and downstream kind of profitability. And so because of that, there is a relatively strong preference for kind of the more mature, though still maybe technically lower income or emerging markets like the ones in Latin America. But the United States and Europe, I think, have a lot to offer. For the last couple of decades, China, or at least a lot of discourse had suggested that China had emerged as kind of the preferred development partner across sub-Saharan Africa, in part because they had a lot of money to invest, they had a lot of money to loan, and they didn't evidently ask as many kind of questions on the domestic politics side when it came to performance around human rights and all of these things that I think that we in the United States and in Europe, people have a shared set of values of what development assistance should be seeking to achieve beyond kind of very, very narrow kind of self-oriented economic interests. And so I think that is an area in which a joint kind of partnership between some Europe and the United States, and also more broadly speaking, other allies, Japan, Korea, et cetera, that might be a fertile area for those kind of discussions to develop. I would also point out that in the shorter term, I think that the likelihood of some sort of club being something being negotiated and then being called a club and claiming victory is very likely. And I think that one of the short-term practical implications of that is that club may, by executive order in the United States, allow members of that club for their products to satisfy the written into the IRA requirements for domestic content sourcing or free trade agreement country sourcing, so that the EU and maybe electric vehicles from Korea or Japan would get similar treatment to domestic vehicles in terms of the tax rebates that are offered for their purchase. I think that would be the most practical thing that would come out of this in the short term.
Well, that is a big discussion because there aren't any free trade agreements between the EU and the US. So
exactly. So this would be the club that would
allow for that.
Satisfy this element and allow it to be hived off from the broader discussion around free trade, right?
But no big joint investments in Europe to try to do this. Rather focus on Africa and Latin America to start with. Is there a ranking of the most important materials that we need the coming 5-10 years?
There are many such lists, Cecilia, and they might be right and they might be wrong, but they are all kind of geared and steered towards the green transition and the electrification of the society. And with the current technology, as we know, it's you can translate that into metal needs of different kinds. So, and you were on that route in the beginning of our discussions, and the increase in need of many of these commodities is several 100% up over a couple of years only. So of course, those lists exist, and those lists also something that the mining companies are looking closely at and going for commodities which pays off, which will give you fluctuation in the prices of these commodities, and they will go up and down as they always do, and they are early in the cycles. So I think you will see a volatile market on metal prices in the coming years, due to the fact that many of these commodities, as I said, they are not, the global demand is not huge. And if you put one new mine on stream, that will influence commodity prices. And that's a different logic compared to the big metals, like steel or copper base metals. So I think the volatility of this will also, of course, partly steer exploration investments. And the exploration investments will go where the jurisdictions are transparent and I guess also trustworthy, I hope. I think it's going to be next coming 10-15 years going to be a lot of volatile prices on critical raw materials.
I think that
Though
I was just going to say that this question of which ones are the most important, I mean, I guess it depends on if we're talking about the overall volumes of increases that would be necessary for critical or for green energy transitions, or we're talking about those that are most susceptible to disruption. So the International Energy Agency is looking at this from a slightly less kind of sort of national type of interest perspective, and they're focusing on things like cobalt and lithium and graphite and rare earths of a variety of different types of rare earths. Those are the ones that, if you look at their reports, that the top line kind of results tend to emphasize. Those aren't necessary. So to the extent that those overlap with a list of those that are most prone to trade-related disruption, I think that rare earths would probably be in that category. As Per mentioned earlier, maybe that's good news, because rare earths are the ones where sort of the marginal increases in the volume of production, either in the United States or Europe or in Canada or Australia, wherever they may be exploited, could have pretty substantial impacts on kind of the import dependency of the United States or the European Union. It's going to be more difficult, I think, to kind of move the needle on those kind of minerals that are mined in bulk according to open pit or strip mining kinds of processes that require massive investments at scale to develop new mining capacity. I think so that would be, I think, the distinction between those, that we're going to need a lot of all of them, but some of them, the trade dependencies probably could be reduced more quickly than others.
But it's, I guess, also it's important to remember, but that many of these commodities are byproducts from other main metal mining. So that's part of the game to understand. But it's also, I think, we're talking about lithium-ion batteries, for instance. Will that at all be on the market in 10 years' time, or is there a different type of battery taking over? So technology is advancing fast in this area. Or cobalt, for instance. So if those batteries are not part of the game anymore, that market will of course collapse. There are you use cobalt for other things as well, but that's the main use, and the same for lithium. Rare earth is a bit different because that sits in so many different high-tech things. So there will be a market for that. And even if there is substitution there as well, I think it's fair to say that we will, at least I think that we will see a high demand for those over the foreseeable future. But for other of these minor metals, there could be disruptive technologies taking them out of the market. And that's just to guess. I mean, what is the development of fuel cells, for instance? That's, we don't really know that today, I would say. So it's an exciting future.
If any of our investors, I was just going to quickly say that if any of our viewers are getting ready to invest in a lithium mine, they might want to look up sodium ion battery technology and look at advances,
for instance,
in that field.
Okay, I wanted to ask you as a last question, then we have several questions from the audience as well. On a short-term basis, is recycling an alternative or is it a supplement? And do we have the technology to do this on a larger scale? Is it because that is also very frequent in the debate, that we should rather focus on recycling? Do we have the laws, the technology, the possibility to do this at a large scale in Europe and in elsewhere?
Well, if it's not the standalone solution, by no means. It will not sustain the world with just recycling. And the pure reason for that is quite simple, because we are getting more and more people on Earth, and all of us requires commodities. So just by recycling everything 100%, it's not enough. And of course, it's true that resource intensity is going down in the Western world, but it's still not, it will not in the foreseeable future be the sole solution. So we need juvenile materials coming on stream on the market. And I think that's, you need to be very clear about that. But then on the other hand, it's not a sustainable world if you don't recycle anything of these new commodities, like it's basically the case today with rare earth, for instance. I think the recycling rate is at a few percent only. But so it also takes some time to get these things on the market to be recyclable. So we will see an increase of recycling of these commodities, and there is a lot of research put into getting processes on stream for recycling batteries, for instance. So the share in the future of recycled materials will increase, and I think that's something also that is a demand from society, from ourselves as stakeholders, and from political side, that we need to think much more smarter about recycling. It's the alternative is not landfills anymore. It's recycling the stuff, but it's not enough.
It's a compliment, but it's far from enough. There are lots of questions from the audience, and I'm sorry to those of you who are looking, we can't take all of them, but we'll try to have. Why don't I read out 3 of them, and then you can answer if you feel that this is within your field. So there's the first one. Can you speak on how consequential the metallic security partnership can be? What are your expectations on the efforts, and what is needed to make it a success? what challenges will that face, and does it have global credibility? That is one question. Is actually more questions, but it's around the Metallics Security Partnership. Then there is one, what are the minerals that you think are easier to escape the current dependencies from the West to China or other countries, and how fast could this happen? We touched a little bit upon this. And then a third one, the supply chains for refining minerals involves use of third-party tolling companies based in different jurisdictions. Can you foresee that to be an issue? Or do you foresee resilience testing for tolling supply chain disruptions could be a part of the periodic business continuing planning? Did you get them more or less? Some of them are very technical, and maybe you want to come back directly to the person who put it. But do you feel that you have anything to say about these? Cullen, you want to start?
Well, sure. I can take the first one. I mean, when we think about the Mineral Security Partnership, this is an initiative that I believe was announced last year, which is really a forum for discussion amongst kind of like-minded advanced economy democracies around, trying. I mean, it's sort of a progenitor to this idea of a purchasers or countries that are primarily on the consumption side having some sort of club in which they agree on certain standards and try to coordinate strategies for developing new supplies. I think that is all to the good. I think that there are other sort of developing countries that have been interested in this kind of partnership. DRC has expressed interest in this, Mozambique, Namibia, Tanzania, a variety of African partners. So that may wind up being a venue in which you actually get discussions that lead to catalytic investment for new capacity. Then again, it may wind up being a forum in which these kind of materials or these kind of discussions signal that there's a lot of policy interest and a lot of emphasis on it, but don't necessarily kind of materialize. I'm not the expert on international negotiations of this type, Cecilia. I believe you are our resident expert on that. So maybe I would pitch that question back to you for any comments that you might have on it.
Should I take the second question? I believe was how can we reduce the dependence on China and what commodities should we go for? Something like that. And I think, well, to start with, in Europe, we produced a list of critical commodities. The first list was published 10 years ago, and that contained, I think, if I remember right, 14 commodities. And now the last list that we published a couple of years back contained 30 commodities, which is sort of this indicating maybe we're going in the wrong direction. But I think we touched on rare earth. I think there are all kind of possibilities if the Western world would like it to be self-sufficient on rare earth. We started off with the discoveries here in Sweden, and there are other deposits in Europe. I know that there is a big potential for rare earth in the US and North America, and for sure in other parts of the world. So I think with the right investments in exploration, as I stressed earlier, I think we can actually take away that dependence. But it's not only the mining part. Cullen, you touched on also the refining thing, and of course what China is doing now is not only controlling the mining part, they are controlling the processing part and the value chain of many of these commodities. So we need to think clever about that part as well. And lithium, that's one of the most common elements in the crust of Earth. It exists basically everywhere, and I'm pretty sure if we want, we can be self-sufficient on that. Cobalt, that's a trickier one. It's a byproduct often byproduct from mining of nickel and copper and other metals like that. So that's probably harder, I would say. It depends a bit because there are a lot of potential in Africa, not only in Congo but in other parts as well. So I think for that it's better to put some effort in to get the mining sustainable in Congo, for instance, and make that mining more acceptable from the Western standards, and that should be taken care of. So I think we have possibilities on basically all the commodities if we want to go that route. So good hope if we want to invest in the right things.
Yeah, on cobalt, I mean, just underscoring this point on the DRC, so that I mean, the very standard narrative that we have in the United States, and I suspect in Europe, it revolves around all of these kind of ills that have been associated with cobalt mining in the Eastern Congo. It's important to note that there's a very big difference between the kind of byproduct cobalt mining that Per was talking about, which is occurring at established copper mining sites that have, many of which have been in operation for decades, have localized smelting capacity, that are already well integrated into global supply chains, and also relatively, comparatively, I think, well governed. The challenges are that you do have this artisanal sector in which there's a lot of employment in artisanal mining, and that is the sector that has been most sort of contaminated, if you will, by the ill effects of armed groups, child labor, and the like. And that transition has already been underway in the United States, in part because of the Dodd-Frank legislation, has motivated a consolidation and movement towards these kind of more industrial scale mining projects in Eastern Congo, and away from the artisanal types, which are a little bit easier for armed groups to kind of penetrate and contaminate.
Thank you. We have several questions concerning Canada as well. You mentioned Northern America, but nobody has really mentioned Canada, and they want to do, they want to mine, they want to process and produce, and also the whole value chain in Canada. Is this a possible partner or rather a competitor on this? Because lots of these rare earths also have been found in Canada, right?
It's both.
Both?
And Canada, I mean, it's a huge potential for these commodities in Canada, and of course it's a favorable trade partner, and we do a lot of things together, but we are still competing, of course. But that's how it should be. So of course Canada is important.
Well, they will have the similar problems with long permit times, and also
I think
they have an indigenous population.
I think they are better in all those aspects, to be honest. They've dealt with this for many years, and the way they discuss with indigenous peoples and so forth. I think we should take some of that back home to Europe, for instance, to in our discussions here in Sweden with the Sami people. So I think they are well ahead of us in that respect.
When in discussions with folks in the industry, the thing that has come up and been echoed time and time again is that if the United States or the European Union or other countries for that matter are interested in looking at a model or sort of the best-in-class model for consultation and collaboration with First Peoples and tribal groups, that Canada is the place to go. And I think in part because of that, it's also the case that Canada's permitting times are maybe half to a third of what they would be in the United States. So they could get shovels in the ground faster in terms of greenfield development. In terms of the actual mineral endowments, I'm out of my depth in terms of talking about what they have and how quickly it could come online. That might be Per's area.
Oh, they have a lot. So anyone that is interested in that should go to Toronto in 3 weeks' time to the PDAC and have a look. There you will see everything.
Okay. So the light comes from Canada, and when it comes to heavy metal, northern Sweden, right? Thank you so much, Colin Hendricks. Thank you, Per Weihed. You've been very generous with your comments on this. I certainly have learned a lot. This is a topic that I think will be high on the agenda for quite some time, as countries all over the world are struggling with the access to these minerals and the green transition, etc. But with all the complications that you have outlined. Thank you to those of you who were listening as well. Sorry for not being able to take all your questions. Some of them were actually in the discussion, so we touched upon it. So thank you so much for watching TradeWinds. Have a nice afternoon or evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.